Hello, everyone. I'm Kevin Gosztola, and welcome to another episode of the Unauthorized Disclosure Podcast. And I'm very pleased to be joined on the show this week by Chip Gibbons, who is the Policy Director for Defending Rights and Dissent. A good friend and colleague, has a forthcoming book on the FBI that has pulled from a lot of freedom of information requests filed over the last several years. It's called the Imperial Bureau by Verso Books. It's forthcoming. It's not available yet.
Forthcoming.
Very forthcoming.
Optimistic release date is in 2027 now, and it's very optimistic.
But this is a project that you've worked on, and in our conversation, you're going to be pulling from some of the work done on this project. So I wish you the best, since that's an aggravating situation to be in when the date keeps getting pushed further and further. But hey, welcome to the show. It's good to talk with you, Chip.
It's always good to talk with you, Kevin.
And so, you saw the outcome of the election, got to go off and spend some time in France, not really dealing with what we've all been sitting in for the last couple.
Texting me, not
what?
You. Everybody just kept texting me like, it's Gates, it's Rubio, and it's like, it's my birthday, and I'm sitting in a restaurant in France. They're bringing out a sparkling firework cake. Please stop fucking texting me about Mike Gates.
Yeah. So we're going to get to Trump's cabinet picks. We'll get to the election and what this might mean for, as he likes to talk about it, the deep state. But first, we have to deal with something that impacts our colleagues, friends, people who do this professional advocacy work and also engage in journalism. And it is this legislation that passed in the House. I'm talking to you on November 21st. It just passed in the House. And if adopted, if it were to get past the Senate, then it would grant some authority, right, as I understand it, to the Secretary of Treasury to be able, or the Treasury Department, to be able to designate nonprofits as terrorist supporting organizations for the work that they do on Palestine. So your organization, Defending Rights and Dissent, came out very hard against it. There are other groups that lobbied to try and get Democrats to not support.
The number of Democrats who voted for it this time was less than the number who voted for it last time. That there was a massive push. Nearly 300 civil society groups really went hard against this bill. I think even the ADL started having second thoughts in public about it, because just civil society groups do not like this bill. And it got such bad publicity that a number of people did flip their votes.
Yeah, all right. So let me give you the floor, and you go ahead and outline what this legislation would do and why people need to understand that this must be stopped.
Sure. So the Stop Terror Financing and Tax Penalties on American Hostages Act, it creates a new designation in the tax code for quote unquote terror supporting nonprofits. Now, I want to give a couple of caveats here. There is already a designation in the IRS tax code for terrorist organizations, Kevin, and you will be surprised to learn this, but terrorist organizations are not entitled to tax deductible status. In addition to not being entitled to tax deductible status, it is a crime to provide material support to a foreign terrorist organization, or which is a designation that the Secretary of State gets to make. And it is also a crime to violate Office of Foreign Asset Control sanctions under the International Emergency Powers Act. So every group that is on the FTO list, the Foreign Terrorist Organization list, is automatically placed on the OFAC Special Designated Terrorist list. So it is like double illegal to support those groups. If you engage in material support for terrorism, you can be prosecuted. If you violate OFAC sanctions by doing an identical act, you can be prosecuted. You can also be prosecuted, or you can also be sanctioned under OFAC itself. Recently, we saw the Palestinian prisoner support group, Samidoun, sanctioned by OFAC in conjunction with the Canadian government, and after a years-long Zionist smear campaign against them. And OFAC sanctions are not criminal penalties, but you really do not want to be sanctioned by OFAC. I cannot begin to explain how much you don't want this to happen, right? You cannot do any financial transactions without a license from the government. That means you can't pay your rent. You can't go to the store and buy a loaf of bread. You can't buy a cup of coffee. You can't even get a lawyer to represent you to challenge the OFAC sanctions unless OFAC grants you a general license. And usually for things like buying loaves of bread and hiring a lawyer, OFAC does grant you the license, but it's incredibly burdensome. And all of your finances are frozen. The International Emergency Powers Act, this is the same law that is used to sanction countries for regime change. This is the exact same the International Emergency Economics Power Act. There's so many of these laws that are conflations of like international emergency power, but it gives the president unilaterally broad powers to implement sanctions to deal with unusual and extraordinary threats to the national security, foreign policy, or economy of the U.S. This law has been used in the Palestine context since 1995, when Bill Clinton used it to create an executive order to sanction terrorists who threatened to disrupt the Middle East peace process. And then, of course, after 9/11, Bush used that to make a broader terrorism law. And an American citizen in Chicago, I believe his name was Mohammed Salah, was the first U.S. citizen ever sanctioned under this law in the 90s. And he was basically kidnapped and tortured by the Israelis in the occupied territories, and tortured. People's Law Office represented him. Judith Miller actually visits him during his torture because the Israeli president or prime minister convinces her that Clinton is covering up Hamas networks in the U.S. along with the FBI and the CIA, and she goes and participates in his interrogation. But these are really broad-based sanctions that have a history of being used against pro-Palestine activists, including very recently Samidoun. And you're probably wondering, why am I bringing this all up? The point being is this law is extremely unnecessary. You cannot get tax-exempt status for an illegal purpose. You cannot get tax-exempt status for being a terrorist. It is a felony to provide material support to terrorism. You can be shut down with OFAC sanctions. This happened to the Holy Land Foundation. This happened to other people involved in humanitarian aid. So the only thing this law is about is creating this new status of terrorist supporting charity that then allows the Secretary of State to sort of fast track and short circuit due process and remove your tax exempt status. And obviously that's a lot less terrible than being sanctioned under OFAC or being prosecuted under the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act or the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. But you're not going to be able to get contributions anymore because they'll be taxed. You're going to have huge stigma attached to it. So it is called the Charity Killer Bill, and it is. And this is the type of bill that has been driven by this McCarthyite mania that has just gripped pretty much the entire Republican Party, but one person, and most of the Democratic Party. It is aimed at pro-Palestinian groups. Students for Justice in Palestine is clearly a target. Samidoun was cited a lot in the hearings as why we need this bill, and now they've been sanctioned by OFAC, which I don't think was a legitimate move by OFAC, but it proves that you don't need this bill. It will have a broad impact because there's nothing in the bill that says this is limited to people in Palestine. This could happen to any charity. It could happen to a nonprofit news organization. It could happen to somebody providing humanitarian support in a war zone. It could happen to somebody, a group engaged in controversial political advocacy. And, our friends, Kevin, our friends, the Democratic Party, keep telling us democracy is on the ballot. Trump's an authoritarian. He's going to do all these terrible things. And, Trump is going to do a lot of terrible things. I don't think we should delude ourselves about that. But, if you're concerned with that, why do you keep giving him tools to use against his political opponents? And why aren't you taking away tools, right? Right now, the Congress, the Senate, could pass the Press Act. They could pass the Fourth Amendment is not for sale Act. They could pass all this good bipartisan legislation defending the American people's Fourth Amendment and First Amendment rights, reining in the deep state, getting goodwill from civil society, the press, the people, and limiting Trump's ability to do damage if you think that's what he's going to do. And, they're not doing it. Instead, they're running around talking about sanctioning the ICC and passing the charity killer bill.
So moving to Trump, which is now our every life, every hour of our lives is now Trump for the next 4 years. And I want to play this clip here of him. This is from earlier in the year. It's from a video in which he gave his message about what he would do to confront the deep state. But I just think this is a good way to set up our questions and conversation about what Project 2025 may be, why he's opposed to the Press Act, and just to get into some of that. So this is just a clip of him declaring that he's going to hunt down leakers.
Fifth, we will launch a major crackdown on government leakers who collude with the fake news to deliberately weave false narratives and to subvert our government and our democracy. When possible, we will press criminal charges.
So I was told that might not be so bad because it's talking about fake news, and this is the cesspool that is Elon Musk's X now. People just show up to you and doubt everything that you say about protecting civil liberties and freedom. And because Donald Trump's just really going to go after the national security state liars that are propagandists and want to take him down. You can respond to that, but a more substantive issue, the more substantive issue is just that he's talking about going after people who blow the whistle, and he's basically establishing a framework for the kind of leak prosecutions or prosecutions against whistleblowers that we've challenged for the last, 10 plus 15 years, however long any of us have been doing this work, going back to Barack Obama.
Oh yeah. So if it's fake news, deep state liars, I hate to break it to you, there's no prosecution, because under the Espionage Act, you have to actually be leaking something that's true. Right? There's no, if I say, and every day on X, I see like 5 posts like breaking news from my anonymous source. Kamala Harris just ate 10 children. Hillary Clinton is horrified. Military tribunals to proceed. If that person claims that's a classified source, they don't get prosecuted under the Espionage Act for posting nonsense, right? In order to be prosecuted, you have to do the unauthorized disclosure of national defense information. So Trump is not talking about fake news. He's not talking about liars. He's talking about people who give truthful information to the media. Of course, people can give truthful information to the media in a manipulative way. The biggest leaker of government secrets in Washington is Washington itself. They love to leak information to sort of flatter what they're doing and shape the narrative. That raises questions for journalistic ethics. But Donald Trump is not concerned with journalistic ethics. He's concerned with protecting himself. And we should remember it was Donald Trump's administration who brought the prosecution of Julian Assange. It was Donald Trump's administration who brought the prosecutions of reality winner Terry Albury, Daniel Hale, and am I missing someone important?
No, I mean, those are the main ones to me. There were others for possession of information, but they didn't have anything to do with the media.
Yeah. So like Donald Trump's administration abused the Espionage Act to go after an FBI leaker, whistleblower, exposing the FBI's abuses, to go after a drone whistleblower who exposed the abuses of the Obama administration, not even Trump revelations, but Obama revelations, to go after WikiLeaks and Julian Assange, who once again, the charges did not involve the Trump administration. It involved the previous administrations. I know Assange also released Vault 7, and that set Mike Pompeo off on the warpath. And there's a lot of speculation that the Vault 7 stuff inspired or caused the indictment. That's a very interesting thing to consider. But Trump was not a friend of deep state opponents. And let's remember, his government sent lethal aid to Ukraine when the CIA told them that'd be a red line, setting the stage for the currently horribly stalemated war and in Ukraine and between Russia that Biden is trying to escalate into World War III in his last days in office, that he escalated sanctions on Iran, including restricting their ability to get necessary aid during COVID. He put these escalate the sanctions of Venezuela. He engaged in the most ridiculous coup plot imaginable with Juan Guaido, who he later described as the Beto O'Rourke of Venezuela, which I think is a pretty apt description of Juan Guaido. But he did really aggressive pro-deep state stuff, and he put people in jail for criticizing the deep state. So I'm not sure why we think he's going to do anything different this time. And we know when Donald Trump wants to put people in jail for leaking or whistleblowing, it's because he doesn't want people to criticize him or paint him in an unflattering picture. And he does have a group of disingenuous critics in the sort of former intelligence community. But there's also a lot of people who have a lot of really good criticisms of Donald Trump, like all the things I just mentioned. So this is not a power we should trust him with. The discourse on Twitter, I will not call it x.com, around this is really unsettling. And I think the next component we're going to talk about is the Heritage Foundation.
So let me just ask you about it. And I don't like to call it X either, but if I'm going to call it, but if I'm going to call it anything, then I will put Elon's name in front of it so that it's like a pejorative label for this social media platform.
Elon Musk's failing cesspool.
Yeah, it is. And I mean, I think at one point, so while you were in France, everyone made this migration to Blue Sky. And if I recall, a couple of days ago, I think it was overwhelmed because there are now tens of millions of people on this platform that have just fled the decrepit and ugly ecosystem that is Twitter now. But substantial issue is Project 2025. Something that I had to confront is Donald Trump disowned this. So Project 2025 is not anything we need to worry about. And in fact, as it turns out, he is appointing people who authored chapters of Project 2025 to be in his administration. The guy that's going to run the FCC wrote the FCC chapter for Project 2025. Now, that's not anything we're going to talk about today, but I would like you to get into, since you've done some work on this, the part of Project 2025 that relates to going after journalists and forcing them to give up their confidential sources, changing some of the ways in which the Justice Department had negotiated a kind of, a little bit of an understanding with the media that they weren't just going to send the FBI after every organization to rifle through their records in criminal investigations.
Sure. So on October the 26th, 2022, Attorney General Merrick Garland put this new policy in place that limited when the Department of Justice could obtain a journalist's communications or compel them to testify. The reason why he did this was there was a revelation. The Trump administration had sought email records for 4 reporters at the New York Times, successfully seized records for phone records for 3 reporters at the Washington Post, and they got phone and email records from a CNN reporter. All of these seizures are part of investigations into leaks of classified information. The Biden administration, in its infinite wisdom, initially continued the Trump administration's legal battle to obtain the Times reporters' emails, and they actually placed the New York Times under a gag order. But then Biden's DOJ later reversed course and put these new policies into place. And I want to talk about, one of the reasons why it is so harmful to have phone records is because or email records. And when we're talking about that, we're not just talking about contents of communications, but who called who and when. Defending Rights and Dissent board member Jeffrey Sterling, who you know quite well, was a CIA whistleblower. He sued the CIA. This is under Obama, so this is not a Trump crime. This is one of Obama's crimes against the Constitution. He sued the CIA for racial discrimination during the Bush years. We're going through like 3 presidents now, very quickly. It got thrown out under the state secrets doctrine. He went to the Senate to blow the whistle on a botched covert action against Iran. And then later, James Risen, who had covered his lawsuit against the CIA, published in his book information about Operation Merlin, the botched covert operation against Iran. And they took him to court under the Espionage Act. Most Espionage Act defendants plead out. Sterling, to this day, maintains his innocence. And they, based on the fact that he had talked to Risen, convicted him under the Espionage Act. And of course, Sterling had a multitude of reasons to talk to Risen. There were other people who could have been the source, but that wasn't enough to convict him. So even if you just have who the journalist called and when, it can identify the source and it can be used to put them in jail. And in the case of Sterling, it can be used to persecute someone falsely who's just a critic of the CIA. I mean, I do not believe the government proved beyond a reasonable doubt that Jeffrey Sterling was guilty of what they accused him of. Obviously, I was not on that jury, and Jeffrey is on my board of directors, so you might say, well, of course Chip's going to say that, but look at the facts yourself. So they put forward this new guidance limiting when they can look at this. In Project 2025, it's buried in the intelligence section. Most of the press freedom groups missed this. I know because I'm in a consortium of press freedom groups, and I was the one to alert everyone that this was happening, that they want the Department of Justice to use all the tools at its disposal to investigate leaks, and they want them to repeal the Garland guidelines, and they want them to prioritize hiring additional counterintelligence and security personnel to do this. I'm going to talk about that more in a minute. And their justification for this, Kevin, you're going to love this. Why we should do this? Personnel have sufficient access to legitimate whistleblower claims under protections provided by the Inspector General on Congress. As you know from your 14 years of reporting on this, there is not sufficient access to legitimate whistleblower claims. And when you go through those claims or channels, as Thomas Drake did, as Jeffrey Sterling did, they prosecute you and try to turn you into a scapegoat for something else. So whistleblower protections are non-existent, and if you use them, even if you don't break the law, they will try to set you up on a criminal investigation. So that is why, and also, if you take something to the IG and they bury it, that does not enrich our democracy. So going outside the quote unquote official channel, by going to the media, by going to the American people and telling them that their government is lying to them about its surveillance of them, about its wars of aggression, about its torture programs, about its regime change operations, that is an incredibly important part of democracy.
This is coming, the proposal from the Heritage Foundation's Project 2025. It's coming at a time that Donald Trump has logged on to Truth Social to fire off one of his missives to say that Republicans must kill the Press Act. That's something that I've been following, you've been following. I'm not sure how many people who listen to this show regularly have any awareness of it, though if they follow my writing at The Dissenter, I've been tracking it as it moves and then stalls and basically is dying in the Senate due to inaction. But can you discuss
inaction by the Democrats?
By the Democrats, and why don't they care? Because this could be some kind of a shield law that made it more difficult for Donald Trump. That's why he wants to kill it. So, I mean, can you get into it? And we should also mention that what's unfolding in the background right now is that Catherine Herridge, who was a Fox News reporter, is fighting a contempt charge. I won't get into what she published because I actually don't think it's very defensible, but she shouldn't be prosecuted for it. And this is happening at a time when you're seeing a lot of journalists and media organizations feel what it could be like under a Trump administration, because a reporter is actually being put in a position where she will go to jail if she doesn't reveal confidential source information.
Yeah, I mean, the Protect Reporters from Exploitative State Spying, or Press Act, it creates a federal press shield, and it limits when the government can seize reporters' communications or communication records. So it would sort of codify sort of what Garland did and go a little bit further. And, you know, the history of these sorts of attorney general guidelines, which is that another attorney general can repeal them later on. So having a law in place is a lot better than having sort of the attorney general like doing like a pinky promise, we won't do this, because then the next attorney general can say, I'm not going to pinky promise this.
Right. And
background noise I got distracted by. I apologize. I'm staying at a relative's house. This is not my China cabinet. I don't own any China. I don't know, in case anyone's thinking, oh, Chip has all these figurines. He says he's a socialist and he owns figurines. They're not mine.
It does look like you're like breaking in from your lavish lifestyle to update us on freedom of the press.
It does look that way, and I don't.
But you should know that a lot of times I talk to him, and he's at a bookshelf and a cat crawling around. So, not that signifies that you're not, you know, upper class or something, but just to say that, like, usually that's not your background.
Adventure
to France.
Yes, I just got back from Paris, and I'm sitting here with my lavish China. You know, yes.
So I do want to play a clip here. So going into Trump, and we've seen several of the nominees. I'm not asking you to describe every single one of them, but I do invite you to speak a bit about what the national security picks for his cabinet might mean for the FBI, and for all of these various civil liberties issues, if there's anything that you've seen that are red flags. But first, I have to play this just because one of the reasons we're here, in my opinion, is because we haven't yet figured out that the public has opinions that need to be respected and understood. And you have establishment Democrats, you have national security state figures that continue to go on television and lob these attacks at people who support Trump that are just plain foolish. And I want to play this clip of Sue Gordon, who was a principal deputy director for the Office of the Director for National Intelligence, so ODNI. And here she is speaking about Tulsi Gabbard, but in a way that who is Donald Trump's nominee for running the director of national intelligence, or being the director of national intelligence. And just for those people who are like, I don't remember what this is, you probably know James Clapper. James Clapper was probably the most well-known DNI in the history of the intelligence agency, at least in the modern era, because he lied and he did that thing where he scratched his head when he was being asked about NSA surveillance. But here is this, she's on, it was Face the Nation.
Another nerve in the intelligence community, of course, is Edward Snowden.
Yes.
Tulsi Gabbard and the selection for the Attorney General, Matt Gaetz, put forward resolutions to call for the charges to be dropped against him because he leaked classified national intelligence material. He's living in Russia these days. That kind of a position, how's that going to be received?
It reflects a lack of understanding of who we are, and it reflects a lack of respect for what we do. Unauthorized disclosures of intelligence are always bad. Don't go with the good or bad, any good outcome, or whether he was right or wrong. He had no authority and he had different paths, and he harmed America. He not only harmed intelligence, he harmed our allies and partners, and he harmed our businesses by what it allowed China to assume about that. There is nothing justifiable about what he's done. None. And so if they vacate it, what they're basically saying is all those rules you follow in order to be able to serve America, they don't matter anymore.
Sue Gordon, thank you for explaining this very opaque world of intelligence to us and for your analysis.
Was my facial reactions visible? Because I'm like... So I really am intrigued by the fact that it doesn't matter if he was right or wrong, or if there was a good or a bad outcome, because usually right or wrong, good or bad outcome are kind of important questions.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah.
The entire government lied to the American people about an unconstitutional, illegal spying program. When it was revealed, the Congress changed the law, not as much as they should have, but they changed the law, which they could not have done before because they wouldn't have known about it. And I think it was the Ninth Circuit found that one of the programs was illegal and likely unconstitutional. And once again, could not have made this ruling had this information not been made public. And the journalists involved all got Pulitzer Prizes. But let's not think about the outcome, which is that we now know our government was lying and spying on us in a way that was illegal and likely unconstitutional, and that all of these secret checks and balances apparently didn't work. Let's not think about that, Kevin.
Yeah, no, exactly.
I'm not going to think about it.
And I have to emphasize, I could have cut the clip before Margaret Brennan. She's the host of Face the Nation, the host there. I could have cut it off, but just her thanking Sue Gordon for helping us understand this opaque world. There really isn't anything profound that Sue is saying in this clip. That sort of like licking by Margaret Brennan to someone who, I looked her up, because these people don't always protect they typically don't protect their profiles on LinkedIn, so you could easily see what they've done. I work her into this show, Chip, just so that I can say that she was at the CIA from 1980 to 2019.
Oh, wow.
And helped start In-Q-Tel. Do you know what In-Q-Tel is?
No, I don't.
It's the CIA's venture fund for investing in Silicon Valley companies to produce technology that can be used for surveillance by the government. So no wonder she doesn't like Edward Snowden as a whistleblower. But then also, I found this to be stunning. She was also, and still apparently holds a position as like a director, although it says part-time now, which is strange, but listed in her resume is that she was a director for CACI. And CACI International just got convicted by a jury of torturing Iraqis at Abu Ghraib. It was a monumental victory for people who were survivors of torture. In any case,
found civilly liable. They weren't convicted. They were found civilly liable. I don't mean the pedantic, but I'm going to do the law thing.
Okay, fine. Be a lawyer. But for me, they found that the company was involved in torture.
Yeah.
Let me, as we begin to wind this conversation down, could you say what your views are right now as you look at these national security picks? Take it in any direction.
I mean, they're mostly bad. We have Rubio, who's a regime change fanatic and a genocide apologist. He pushed Trump during the last term to pursue the ridiculous regime change policies against Venezuela. He's big on regime change in Cuba. He, is big on attacking Iran. He is 100% backing Israel's genocide in Gaza. He is sending letters to the FBI asking them to investigate people who are engaged in protest against the genocide. Not a good guy, really terrible person. Then we have Representative Elise Stefanik to be the UN ambassador. She has been in the House essentially playing this almost House Un-American Activities Committee-like role against student protesters and academics who have First Amendment protected views about a genocide that they do not like. Hello, Marcus. This is the cat you referenced. He's coming to join us. So we have a McCarthyite in service of apartheid and genocide. Then we have Marcus, you gotta move. Then we have Mike Huckabee as ambassador to Israel. Mike Huckabee has said there's no such thing as the occupied West Bank. It is Judea and Samaria. And we know that Israel is going to use Trump's election to try to formally annex the West Bank, which I cannot begin to tell you what a major violation of international law that is. And for everyone who is upset about Crimea and Russia and Ukraine, all these things, they better be equally upset about the annexation of the West Bank, which is purely illegal under international law. I have a note here about Gates, but he's gone.
Withdrew his nomination.
Withdrew because apparently
the sex pest stuff caught up.
Yeah, not looking so good. And then we have I have Vets for Freedom guy. I know his name. I'm blanking on it. The Secretary of Defense.
Peter Hegseth?
Peter Hegseth, whose political career started by founding Vets for Freedom, a group that was started to lobby to keep the Iraq War going. What a noble cause, keeping the Iraq War going. He's also called the U.S. left a domestic enemy and said, while we're fighting the enemy abroad in Iraq, we have to fight the enemy at home. This very sort of Bush right-wing conspiracy theories, also recycled from the Cold War about how, we have a domestic left enemy that is stopping us from, fighting our enemies abroad. God forbid the U.S. left, causes us to only stay in Iraq for 15 years as opposed to like 1,000 years. Terrible news. And then there is Tulsi Gabbard, who I have in my note is a wild card. I worked with Tulsi Gabbard's office when she was in Congress on Assange and on Snowden. Apparently, per Susan Gordon, I must not have a very good understanding of how the intelligence community works. Gabbard had a perfect record on surveillance issues. She has a better record than most people on foreign policy. Infamously, she said, "I'm against regime change wars, but I'm a hawk on the war on terror." It's not really clear to me what she views as a regime change war versus the war on terror, because she counts the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan as a regime change war. She did some really interesting stuff. She went to Standing Rock with a group of veterans to protect the protesters. She resigned from the DNC to support Sanders. And like 5 years ago, she had a platform that was all of this sort of standard Bernie-crat stuff. Medicare for all, codify Roe versus Wade, protect LGBT rights, bomb less countries. She had a bill that would have limited sanctions if they impacted civilians. And then in sort of her post office life, as Michael Tracy has documented, she's flip-flopped on a lot of this as she has pursued this role as this right-wing culture warrior in the Fox News speaking circuit, which has been really hard to watch. I mean, she's always had troubling ties to Modi. She's always had some sort of anti-Muslim strand to her that made her difficult. She's flip-flopped on Israel a lot. She used to be close with Christians United for Israel, but when she was running for president as an anti-war candidate, she sort of went more critical of Israel. In recent years, and I really recommend Jeremy Scahill's piece in Drop Site News. It is the best piece I have ever read on Tulsi Gabbard, and I have read so many pieces on Tulsi Gabbard over the last 10 years because we never get enough of talking about Tulsi Gabbard. Is she an anti-war figure? Is she an Islamophobe? Is she a secret fascist? Is she a progressive Bernie cat, right? Like, I've read all these pieces. And I think that Jeremy Scahill's piece really does an objective, nuanced analysis of where she actually stands, where she's really good, where she's ambiguous and has flip-flopped, and where she is objectively terrible. And where she is objectively terrible is on the genocide in Gaza. She has appeared at pro-war rallies. She has accused the Biden administration of not doing enough to support the genocide. She has claimed that Hamas is not an armed or a group opposed to sort of the occupation of their land, but is a global radical Islamic network that wants to take over the world and attack Hindus and Christians and all these other people. And I think she has associated the protesters here with Hamas, which is really upsetting to me personally. And if I ever somehow find myself in a room with Representative Gabbard, what I would say to her is that you have been unfairly smeared as an agent of Russia for raising good faith dissenting opinions on U.S.-Russia policy, on U.S.-NATO policy. Why are you doing the same thing to Americans who you may disagree with, who are raising good faith criticisms of Israeli policy? Like I always tell people, you can disagree with Tulsi Gabbard on Russia, but that doesn't make her a Russian agent. So I don't understand why she is repeating that. Well, I do understand why. I do not understand why she is repeating the same line of attack that is going to be used to sink her nomination against these young people who are protesting genocide. And I find that really troubling. I have really mixed feelings about what her directorship would mean. In terms of Trump nominations, she's the least bad. In terms of people who have been nominated to direct the national intelligence, I think she's probably the least bad as well, in that she's consistently been against surveillance. But when you look at the ties to Modi, when you look at the incredibly ridiculous comments about Gaza, about the student protest, and when the previous Biden person in this position is saying Iran is inciting the protest, it is really concerning, and it is an asterisk. And if she had her consistently anti-war position, consistently anti-intervention position, consistently anti-surveillance position applied to Gaza, I would be 100% in favor of her in this position. And I wouldn't oppose her. I'm speaking on behalf of myself. My organization has made no position here. I would not oppose her at this point, but there are enough reservations here that I could not, in good conscience, I think, I'm hesitant to make a determination, but I think there's some questions that need to be asked.
Yeah, and also
no one in the Senate Judiciary Committee from the Dem or Intel Committee from the Dem side is going to ask them. They're just going to scream McCarthyite nonsense at her, and no one's going to ask, do you think student protesters are puppets of Hamas? And if so, will you use foreign counterintelligence tools against them?
Right. And also, in my favorite clip from an era of Joe Rogan that is a very bygone era at this point is of Barry Weiss being Yeah, saying that Tulsi Gabbard is an Assad toady, and so she's going to get hit for her trip to Syria relentlessly by Democrats. And actually, I think I'm going to insert it just for some comic relief. I love what Barry Weiss does there to expose herself as an absolute buffoon, and I despise the fact that every day there is this media organization that calls itself the Free Press that is such well, it's barely better than Elon Musk's Twitter. We lived through the last 4 years almost of Joe Biden, and the Republicans, particularly in the House, had this weaponization of the U.S. government, regular committee hearings. And I thought that a fair amount of them were focused on absolute crap, just like nonsense that wasn't really even attacks on people. Like, I did some digging, and they were upset about parents being put on like a terrorism watch list or something because they were
tag. It was not a watch. It was not even a watch. It was a threat tag.
It was like they got a threat tag because they were unruly at school board meetings. And as I looked into it, I found that like that was pretty heavily exaggerated, and there wasn't really any action taken against these people. That being said, under Trump, all those weaponization of U.S. government hearings will be suspended for the time being so that Donald Trump can assert his power. And I guess that's where I leave us. I think the thing that I want to leave us in our conversation is that, because you hit this really well with, you were talking about Tulsi and how she thinks that Hamas is behind a lot of the student protests, or probably does if she hasn't been that clear already. And that's going to be coming up. That'll come up during the hearings. And so my question to you is, like, you were going to talk about the deep state and what Donald Trump could do about it, but I think it's probably more useful to our conversation to be practical and say, aren't we pretty much looking at an incoming administration that's just going to take the tools that are at their disposal and turn them against their preferred targets? I mean, the thing that's the objection of the weaponization of U.S. government to me always seems to be that they believe all these tools are being directed at Christians and conservative people. None of those people should be targets of government surveillance, by the way. But Tulsi, with her ideology, could support foreign intelligence surveillance abuses or look the other way when those abuses occur if they're being directed against Palestinian protesters.
Depending on what her public stance on Palestine is that day. I mean, she's flip-flopped on that issue multiple times. Can I actually tell a story about the weaponization of the government committee that I've never told in public before, that I actually think is very illuminating about how broken both sides of this issue are?
Yeah, absolutely. And then we'll end with that story.
So when they announced the committee, it had been announced, and I was sitting home one day eating dinner in my house, and I get a call from the Hill from someone in a, let's just say, very left-leaning office. And they call me up and they say, you know, this is after hours. I'm eating dinner. I don't usually take work calls during dinner, but I did. And they say, Chip, what if we got on the weaponization of government committee? There are several very left-wing members of Congress, I'm not going to name their names, who want to be on the committee and want to call the Republicans bluff. They want to go after the prosecution of Julian Assange. They want to go after the use of the FBI against Black Lives Matter protesters. They said to me, we will expose every actual human rights abuse from Eugene Debs' imprisonment to the current day. Will you help us do this? And I said yes. And, you know, we were talking about, because, you know, I've written bills to reform the Espionage Act. I did a lot of work on the Hill around Assange. I've written bills that have never been introduced to reform the FBI. And I was told that we would work around those bills and we would push an actual agenda of how to go after weaponization of government to just totally, I don't want to use a bad word on your program, Kevin, but just totally fuck with Jim Jordan and actually
You can, though.
Something. I just did, Kevin. I just did. I know I can. We just totally and actually get answers. And if you want to prove if they're spying on Christians or they're spying on Antifa, the FBI has publicly done these dumb categories that put like Puerto Rican independence activists, anarchists, and militias and the Ku Klux Klan all in one category. Their internal classification system for case investigations does not do that. They have a designation 100K, that is terrorist enterprise investigation, Black separatist. They have 100N, terrorist enterprise investigation, white supremacist. They have 266K, Black active terrorism, Black separatists, 266N, white supremacists. They have those same classifications for anarchist, for Puerto Ricans, for animal rights activists, for environmental activists, for abortion activists, for sovereign citizens. If you are a Republican and you really believe all the investigations are into white Christians, I will tell you what information to get a subpoena from the FBI that will either prove you right or prove me wrong, and let the chips fall where they may. But no one on the right has ever approached like that. But I was actually talking about helping good Democrats, and I would help a good Republican too, like I said, like actually ask real questions. And the hope was that we could maybe team up with one of the libertarian Republicans on the committee who is like not someone I want in charge of abortion or Social Security, but good on Assange, and push the Assange issue, push the actual FBI issue. And it was totally frowned upon by the House leadership. And instead of putting on a Democrat who would challenge the FBI and challenge the deep state, they put on people like Debbie Wasserman Schultz and former prosecutors to sit there and do PR and puff pieces for the deep state, while the Republicans got to pretend they were anti-deep state when it really counts, they're pro-so, and pursue these crank things. And that just sums everything up to me.
Yeah.
And I've never told that story publicly before. And I probably shouldn't have told it.
So if you wanted to give final thoughts, where does that leave us headed into Trump?
We are going to see Donald Trump do more regime change, more surveillance, probably more Espionage Act. He's not going to do anything about the genocide in Gaza. He might make it worse. He will escalate the attacks on Americans who do not want their taxpayer money going to genocide. And the Democrats are going to yell, it's like you're soft on you're soft on Putin, Mr. Trump. In the same way that Biden was beyond Reagan or Bush in his willingness to support Israeli crimes. And we still hear, oh, he's not satisfactorily supportive of Israel. He's an anti-Semite. He's afraid, as Tulsi Gabbard says, he's afraid to say radical Islam because it will make him politically incorrect. And it's like, man, said a lot of weapons to be used in a genocide. I don't think he's afraid of being labeled politically incorrect by the woke left. So I don't have high hopes for the Trump years.
Well, I don't think there's any reason for us to. We're going to be fighting for our survival. But I'll be there in the trenches, and I look forward.
One thing. I do think we should all say, Donald Trump, if you are really against the deep state, pardon Edward Snowden on day one. And I'm 100% willing to work with libertarians who think Trump is great, even though I'm skeptical, to pressure him to pardon Trump. He will pardon Trump on day one, pardon Snowden on day one, and I will work with progressives and libertarians to attack Trump when he does bad things. Like I'm willing to do whatever it takes to advance the issues, whoever the president or the party is.
And as well, I think that's what we should do. And I think we should look for those pressure points, also those fault lines, those divisions, and try to take advantage of whatever we can to get the least worst outcomes, or perhaps maybe we'll surprise ourselves and something will happen that benefits people. But with that being said, thanks, Chip, for joining to be on the show. This is an important conversation, and I'll have to talk with you again next year as we have examples of Donald Trump engaging in acts of repression.
And